Love is the doctrine of this church. How many dozens, how many hundreds of times have each of us perhaps uttered these words within the walls of this sanctuary over the years? Every Sunday, we conclude every worship service here by reciting a covenant that begins with that bold declaration: love is the doctrine of this church. Like all Unitarian Universalist churches, UUCJ has no creed. That is to say, we have no set of required beliefs that we demand individuals subscribe to or publicly pronounce as a requirement for membership. But though we are creedless, we are not doctrineless. Now, the word doctrine can be a little scary, but all it means literally is teaching. That's it. So every week, we all proudly declare that we collectively as a church, that we have a teaching. In fact, we have only one teaching if our covenant is to be believed and taken seriously. The one core teaching of this church is love. Now, if you're only going to have one teaching, you can't do much better than love, I guess. Love, of course, is recognized perhaps universally as the greatest of all goods, the highest of all virtues, the most aspirational of all ideals. Love has been lauded by poets and philosophers for as long as there have been poets and philosophers. God is love. So the Christian Bible tells us. So to all you UUCJers out there, by choosing love as our one core doctrine, I think you chose wisely. You went with the obvious choice. You didn't overthink it. So good job. Pat yourself on the back. So since love is our one core teaching or doctrine, everyone in here, and especially those of y'all who have been here the longest, and some of y'all have been here for decades, since love is our one core teaching, I assume that all of you in here should be able to have no problem at all in telling me exactly what love is. Oh, some eyes just went to the floor. I know that trick. I used to be a teacher. Look, I understand the consternation. Much like God and art, love is one of those pesky, teeny tiny little words that hides within it an enormous and enormously complex definition. But if love truly is the doctrine of this church, then we must regularly attempt the struggle of defining this gigantic little word. And I think a good place to start is by examining one of the most famous descriptions and definitions of love available to us. I'm referring, of course, to what Thomas just read for us, the words of the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Christian church in the city of Corinth. This is also known as 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's also known by some folks as the love chapter of the Bible. But you don't have to be a Christian theologian or to be familiar with the words in order to be familiar with the words of 1 Corinthians 13. If you haven't heard these words in a Christian worship service, chances are you've probably seen them maybe on a Hallmark card somewhere or perhaps recited at a wedding. Paul's thoughts on the subject of love in 1 Corinthians, they're profound, they're moving, they are beautiful. They transcend religion. They ring true in the heart. And so it's little wonder that his words have permeated our cultural conscience for nearly 2,000 years. And very likely his hymn to love will be just as popular another 2,000 years from now, assuming we're not all under the water at that point. But keeping in mind the incredible complexity of this thing called love, I do not believe that Paul's thoughtful description of it should be considered exhaustive. That is to say, his thoughts on love ought to be considered a floor rather than a ceiling. a necessary but not sufficient analysis in order for anyone to fully wrap their heart, soul, or mind around this greatest of all virtues. Paul's view of love in the Corinthian letter is but one facet of a multifaceted gem, and certainly not meant to be the final word on love, as if such a thing could or should exist. And I think it's actually to our collective detriment that Paul's writing on love has so often been treated as such. As a result of the centrality granted to Paul's view on this subject, we 21st century Westerners have inherited a particularly narrow view of love that, quite frankly, has not always served us well. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Paul's description and definition of love is apt and true and beautiful. He highlights love's softness, its tenderness, its meekness, and all of these qualities, we all should aspire to possess and express them. And I would like to suggest there are also more qualities of love that we should aspire to possess and express. And that's what this worship series is going to explore. Now, how many of you have ever played Mad Libs? Few hands? Okay, not as many as I thought. Okay, so it's super fun. Let me explain what Mad Libs are. See, I loved to fill these things out as a child. So for those of you who don't know, with a Mad Libs, you start with like a written paragraph. But in the paragraph, someone has already pulled out all of the important words, leaving behind blank spaces with only a specific part of speech underneath each blank. So then what you do is you go around and you fill in the blanks without looking at the rest of the paragraph for context, which then results in all kinds of hilarious nonsense while still being grammatically coherent. So inspired by my childhood love of Mad Libs, I decided to take Paul's timeless description of love from 1 Corinthians and kind of turn it into a Mad Lib. Well, kind of. It's not quite perfect, but what I did is I took out all the important descriptive words from the original text and I replaced them with blanks. You can see the fruit of my labor on the insert in your order of service. Now, what I'm going to do over the next several weeks is every Sunday I am going to begin to fill in those blanks. I am going to retain Paul's original syntax and structure, but I'm going to replace the structure and substance of his definition of love and thereby create kind of my own, I guess, Unitarian Universalist love chapter. So by the end of the series, we will have in our hands a 2018 UUCJ remix of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And I'd like to note that my own attempt at describing love through this series is not meant to be any more exhaustive than Paul's. I humbly offer but one more facet to consider, a facet, hopefully, of particular use and value and resonance in the context of the times we happen to find ourselves in. A perspective that perhaps adds a bit of balance, a definition of love suitable for more than just weddings and Hallmark cards. I'd also like to note that the words that I will choose for this series, these new descriptors of love that I'm going to select week to week, they will all have been inspired and informed by my own spiritual journey over the past several years, but especially through the lens of Unitarian Universalism, and quite specifically from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville. I think that is really, really important. You know, the relationship between a church and its minister is always a two-way street. Over the past several years, I've had the opportunity and privilege to help influence the life of this church. But what might not be quite so obvious is just how much this church has served to influence my life over the same time. I've been deeply impacted by the relationships I've built here, by the people who have become like family to me, by their diversity of viewpoints and their deeply held values and principles. I have been similarly influenced by the hopes, dreams, and expectations of those people who are no longer with us, people like Duncan Fletcher and Charles McGee. They form part of an invisible cloud of witnesses whose legacy I, along with so many of you, consciously strive to live up to. And the more that I learn of these individuals, the more inspired I become to help carry their torch. Honoring our ancestors has become increasingly important to me in my time here. This church, its history, and its people have indelibly shaped me, they have shaped my ministry, and they have no doubt shaped my current understanding of love. So, without any further ado, with our remaining time together today, I will concisely reveal my first two blanks. Where Paul originally declared that love is patient and love is kind, I would like to suggest that love is fierce and love is powerful. The dictionary defines the word fierce as menacingly wild, savage, hostile, or furiously intense. The word fierce comes to us from the Latin term ferus, which also serves as the root to the English word feral. And what it means is it means wild and untamed. Fierce love is primal. It is undomesticated. This descriptor helps to remind us that love at its core is not an invention of modernity and civil society. It is not the result of an evolved prefrontal cortex. It is not the product of the age of enlightenment. Love's source is not the mind. In fact, I don't even think it's the heart. Love's roots lie deeper. Love starts in the guts, the viscera. And I'm not just talking about the romantic and lusty kind of love either. I'm talking about all love. All love at its core carries with it a sense of longing and desire. At its core, love is hunger. It is need. It is desperation. When I think of the fierceness of love, I think of the mama bear that will do anything to protect her cub. This kind of love, this fierce kind, oh, it is very dangerous. It can lose control of itself easily. It can spread like wildfire, consuming and destroying everything in its path. And it requires, therefore, great wisdom and great restraint in order for it to maintain some semblance of control. So while this kind of love ought never to go unchecked, it also ought not ever be fully extinguished, because life is more than a cold intellectual exercise. Fierce, passionate, primal love is core to the human experience, and it is the greatest source of our greatest power. And make no mistake, as I have already suggested this morning, love is powerful. I could offer you some of my own thoughts on the relationship between love and power, but anything I say would be a pale, inarticulate shadow of what has already been said far more thoughtfully and far more eloquently by a man who was a master in both love and power. In August of 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed the 11th Convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. He gave a speech that answered the question, where do we go from here? And in the midst of that response, he offered the following observations about the relationship between love and power. Now, a lot of us are preachers, and all of us have our moral convictions and concerns, and so often we have problems with power. But there is nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly. You see, what happened is that some of our philosophers got off base, And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with a resignation of power and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused the philosopher Nietzsche, who was a philosopher of the will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was this same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. Now, we have got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. In applying this idea to the civil rights movement of his day, the Reverend Dr. King observed that many white Americans were operating with a power absent love, while many black Americans were wielding a love with no power, all of which led him to conclude, it is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our times. Love must have the ability not only to inspire transformation, but sometimes to actively force change, because love is no one's punching bag. Love ought never be misinterpreted to suggest that innocent people should bear unnecessary suffering for no reason, or that bearing such suffering with a smile is somehow a sign of great virtue, deep spirituality, or some other kind of faux enlightenment. Love cannot be afraid to amass power, which means that love must have confidence in its own ability to wield power responsibly. Love must believe that it can effectively use such power for the greater good, to reshape the world, or to quote from one of our favorite hymns, to give life the shape of justice. Love does not shrug its shoulders and resign itself to the status quo if the status quo is evil. So as I begin to conclude today, I want to affirm again, love is certainly patient, and it is also most certainly kind. And I am also equally certain that love is fierce and powerful. And I'd like to suggest that if these adjectives don't feel like a natural fit, if these words in conjunction with love, if they stick in your craw a bit, if they don't roll off the tongue easily, I would suggest that perhaps this is simply because we haven't been reading or reciting these verbal formulations for 2 millennia. But maybe if we do, the church and the world will one day look very different. So my charge to all of us this week is this: try these new words on. Give them a test drive without letting go of patience or kindness. Be intentional this week about finding ways to love fiercely. Embrace your emotions. Take hold of your feelings, and not just the ones from your heart, the ones deep in your guts. Listen to your instincts. Return to the wilderness and embrace your wildness. Step fully into your own power. And that little civilized voice in the back of your head that's always telling you to check yourself, to step back, to quiet down in order to keep the peace. Tell that voice to take a hike this week. Live and love boldly, without apology and without excuse. Amen and blessed be.